We are on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis 21b, top of the page. The Gemoro now takes us back to the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah taught us, after telling us about the merit that can sustain a woman, a guilty woman who's guilty of Sotah, but the merit can sustain her after a certain amount of time, can prevent and hold off her demise after drinking the Sotah waters. The Gemara, the Mishnah didn't told us about a dispute between Ben Azai and Rabbi Lezer. Ben Azai said that a person ought to teach his daughter Torah. I just pulled back up the Mishnah here on the page. That one ought to teach their daughter Torah. So that way, she'll have merit. Right? That's what Ben Azai said. Let's see. Right? Oh, sorry, not just that not that she'll have merit from the Torah learning. I'm sorry, but by learning Torah, she'll know that the reason why, if one day it comes to a situation where she's guilty and she drinks Sotah water and she doesn't have her demise right away, she might doubt the Sotah water. But because she learned Torah, she'll know that the reason why it's not affecting her right away is because she has some merit. So the teaching of a woman Torah preserves the dignity of the effectiveness of the Sotah water. So it's not just for her, I assume, but even if she sees another woman drink the Sotah water and nothing happens to that woman, then this woman will know, oh, she has some merit. Okay. That was Ben Azai's view. Rabbi Lezer took a different view, which is, no, anyone who teaches his daughter Torah is like teaching her promiscuity, because she knows the loopholes and how to get away with things and how to use merit to defend herself even when she's misbehaving. That was a dispute. And then there was a next statement from Rabbi Shua, which said a woman prefers a small measure of food and intimacy rather than lots of food, meaning lots of wealth, and no intimacy. That was Rabbi Shua's statement. The Gemara is going to get to why Rabbi Shua's statement follows the dispute between Ben Azai and Rabbi Lezer. So let's go back to our page. Okay, so 21a, be at the top. That's where we are. 21a. What did I say? 21b. Sorry, 21b. Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. The top. Omer Ben Azai. Ben Azai says, the first words in the line there, Chayiv Adam Lilmud as etc. A man is obligated to teach his daughter Torah, so that way she'll know that the reason why her or someone else isn't meeting their demise after drinking the Sotah water is because they have some merit. Rabbi Lezer says, Kol Malamed is B'tei Torah. Anyone who teaches his daughter Torah, Malamda Tiflus, is teaching her promiscuity. Now, I urge everybody, certainly you remember, but if you don't, to revisit the class we gave on the Mishnah when we learned this Mishnah. So there we explained the history of women learning Torah, and then explained the Rebbe's position. We talked about the obligation for women to study the laws related to them, which is a huge amount of Torah, laws of Shabbos, laws of marriage, love of God and fear God, which includes Hasidic philosophy and so on. So there's lots and lots that a woman is obligated to study. And further, I explained the Rebbe's position on the matter. And in brief, again, we look at that class again where we explain it in more detail. And for those watching online, I'll put a link in the description to the previous class. Yeah. So we explain in detail, but essentially the Rebbe's position is that nowadays, not teaching a girl Torah, that would be teaching her promiscuity, because of the availability of information. You cannot shelter anyone from finding any information. And if you don't teach your daughter how to learn Torah properly, she'll find it somewhere else. And the source she gets it from could be extremely questionable. And then she'll end up on a, it's right. So what you're trying to defend, you're trying to forfend, is the right word, trying to forfend that your daughter doesn't end up, misusing Torah in the wrong way. That'll happen if you don't teach your Torah, because she'll find it somewhere else. We get into that in more detail in the video in that class then when we learned in the Mishnah.
Every Friday night.
Yeah, you mentioned that. It's a beautiful thing.
Sit down with my granddaughter, my older one. We discuss the Torah.
It's a beautiful thing. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing.
We both learn.
So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Gemara itself and see how the Gemara comments. And we're going to learn the Gemara on the literal level. And again, I ask you to put the Gemara on its literal level in the context of what we just explained and more elaborately in the class when we did the Mishnah itself. Then I'm going to suggest a Kabbalistic reading to the Gemara, which will apply universally, not just to women per se. So let's see. First, the Gemara says, Tiflus, do you mean to say that a person who teaches his daughter Torah is teaching her promiscuity? Salkadaitach, that's what you mean to say? Elaim, or rather, you should add one word. Kilu lambda tiflus. It's as if he taught her promiscuity. Torah itself is not promiscuity, God forbid. But it's as if you taught her promiscuity. Now, when we learned the Gemara, when we learned the Mishnah, right, let's go back to that Mishnah and see Rashi's comment there. When we learned the Mishnah, we said that teaching her promiscuity, teaching her, the Torah is like teaching her promiscuity because she'll know to give herself merit. I think that's how we understood it then. Rabbi Lezer's view. But the Gemara here, Rashi over here comments and says that by teaching her Torah, it's as if you're teaching her promiscuity because she'll learn to be clever and conniving and will do her thing, do her misbehaviors in private. So kind of conceal her. You've taken away her innocence. If she's innocent, this is what seems to be the simple reading. Again, I asked you to put in context of the discussion we had earlier about women learning Torah and the history of that. But it would seem like if she's innocent, she's like has an innocent mind, she doesn't do anything. But as soon as she starts to study and becomes very clever, she loses that innocence and she'll find a way to sneak and hide. And
she has a free choice.
Certainly she has a free choice. But as a parent, we also have free choice, right? Sorry?
I want to get off subject, but why doesn't that apply to men? Why is the Torah not considered where he finds loopholes?
Yeah.
I don't know. And obviously, there's a difference with women.
Right. So I assume it's in historical context, which is what we were talking about in that previous class. Historical context of women's place in society and men's place in society. And
that's why a man doesn't have to drink the Sotah water.
Well, he gets tested too by her drinking the Sotah water. But that's what I think it means on a basic level. But again, as I mentioned before, we're going to learn it on a Kabbalistic level, which I do believe applies universally. Right? We'll get to that soon.
That's what Rashi was saying.
Yep, that Rashi says that she'll understand how to be loser. Through Torah, she understands her mummy sounds like schemes or like cleverness. And she'll do her things in secrecy. That's the way those are Rashi's words in their translation. So, which means kind of, so I think it means to lose her innocence and she'll find ways to sneak and, and again, I believe it's not to be understood in the historical context of women's position. But again, we'll see in a moment when we get there. I'll demonstrate what I think it means Kabbalistically and how that's universal. I want to see Rabbi Stein. I just want to see Rabbi. Sorry, she'll know how to game the system exactly because she lost her innocence. She'll know how to game the system.
One thing that turns a lot of women off.
Let me see how Rashi translates it. How Steinsaltz translates it. 21b. Yeah, that's a different discussion.
That turns a lot of women off.
Oh, he didn't say that.
He doesn't, the verse doesn't exactly say why it says if he teaches you promiscuity. Let's see its commentary on the Mishnah. See if he says anything on the Mishnah. I was looking at my phone to see what he says in the Mishnah. As for that statement about the blessing we make every day, thanking God we're not a woman. So actually right there on the shelf, you'll see a little booklet, pamphlet my father wrote on the subject. And you can have a look at that. But the basic reason are two. Number one is, you see that pamphlet there? That's it. You can have a look at that later. But the basic reason is two things. Number one is because a man has more mitzvahs. You're thanking God for the extra mitzvahs. And and the basic reason number two is because a woman goes through childbirth. And I mentioned this morning.
Yeah.
The father's contribution to physically making the child is a lot less complicated than the woman's contribution to making the child. So that's the deal with that. But again, it's not a subject of our discussion. Okay, Rabbi Stein doesn't comment. Okay, so let's see the Gemoro further. So again, the Gemoro just comments first of all to say that Torah itself is not God forbid promiscuity, but by learning Torah, it says if he teaches her promiscuity because she learns how to game the system and to be sneaky. Okay, so Amar Rabbi says, my time again. I want to go through this literally, and then I'm going to give the Kabbalistic interpretation, which I think applies to everybody. Amar Rabbi says, my time with Rabbi Lezer. What is the reason for Rabbi Lezer? How did Rabbi Lezer derive this notion that there's a possibility for someone to learn, for a woman or someone at all in general, to learn Torah and not lead to promiscuity, that lead to one gaming the system, to be sneaky. So because the verse reads in Mishlei, you see the literal meaning of the verse. The verse reads, Ani chachma, I become wise. Shachanti arma, I rest with like cleverness. But again, this word arema, which means cleverness, also means to like be scheming. And that's the word we described earlier. That is if she's promiscuous because she learns to game the system. Harmonious, different word for a similar thing. Let's just see the 1 second here. Sorry. Okay, went too far.
It could be the opposite of what you said too.
Which is? Cunning. That's the right word. That's the translation. It's cunning. Arema is cunning. I dwell in cunning. It's like through wisdom, a person becomes more cunning, loses his innocence, and because to start to learn to game the system. And that itself can come to Torah study. This is what the verse says in Mishlei. I become wise and I dwell in cunning. So now I become more capable of scheming. As he says, as soon as a person incorporates wisdom, Torah wisdom, but Adam in the person, comes along with it this cunning, this cleverness of scheming and gaming the system. So to your point, Robert, here, Rabbi Bo, when he explains Rabbi Lezer's reason, he says, Adam, as soon as it enters into a person, wisdom, not a woman, but a person. So, which means that Rabbi Bo is already opening the window for what we're going to offer soon, that this actually applies universally, not just to women, even though Rabbi Lezer originally said it about women. And I'm going to explain why, Kabbalistically speaking, Rabbi Lezer says it about women, perhaps.
It still comes to choice, because when you're a man or a woman, you're learning about this, and you take it either way.
Exactly my point.
You know exactly what to avoid.
Right. So I do believe it applies. I do believe it applies universally, and I'm going to explain how Kabbalistically. And I'm just pointing to Rabbi Bo when he gives Rabbi Lezer's background, quoting this verse, which says, "I am wise and I dwell in cunning." When he explains that, he says like this: when wisdom, Torah, enters into a person, it doesn't say a woman, it says a person, meaning that can include man as well. So along with that comes the capacity for cunning and scheming and gaming, right? So the question becomes, why then Rabbi Lezer is singling out women? So I'm going to offer, when we're done this, I'm going to offer an explanation Kabbalistically as to why Rabbi Lezer he singles out women. Although on the basic level, he means women. And I think on the basic level, it goes in the historical context of what we explained in the previous class.
Well, it could just be on the simple level.
Sorry?
It could be on the simple level. This is the topic of discussion for Sotah.
Say it. Say it.
I'm saying it could be on a simple level why he's singling out women because it's the topic of discussion.
Right, but it doesn't say so. Yeah, he would never say though, a person shouldn't teach his son Torah. He never says such a thing, right? Torah says teach your son Torah. Teach it to your children, teach it to your son, literal translation.
Yeah.
Right, but it does say it about women. Right. So maybe you're arguing that Rabbi Eliezer would really say don't teach anybody Torah, but we have no choice. We have to teach children Torah, so we'll teach it to our sons.
Yeah.
Right? It seems like he's singling out women. And I imagine it's because of the historical context that women didn't have the capacity because of the societal structure, women didn't have the same access to learning on the level of men did, and therefore they would end up with like a half a story and not get the full picture. Whereas a man who has the capacity to go through the proper learning might be able to get a full picture. That's what I think it means in the historical context. But again, as I mentioned, quoted from the Rebbe, because of the historical context today, it changes. Right? A woman should learn Torah, otherwise you're leaving her with half a picture. If you don't teach her, then she's going to get a half a picture. Whereas in the old day, if you didn't teach her, what was she left with? Nothing, zero. So leave it with zero. What does she know more for? But a guy who has to know more, you got to teach him the whole thing properly. Whereas today, there's no such thing as leaving anyone with zero information. You either leave them to their own vices and they get bad information, or you give them good information. Right? So again, that's why I think the literal meaning is in historical context, I believe. But on the Kabbalistic level, I'm going to explain why perhaps women are being singled out here, even though as we learned from Rabbi, it's as soon as a human person acquires wisdom, he acquires cunning, applying it universally, not just to women. So we'll get to that in Kabbalistic in a moment. Yeah, we're clear?
No, I just don't understand why so many women are left out of, the Torah does describe a lot of women, but so many women are left out. Like Adam and Eve when they had twin girls. Like Jacob, when his wives gave birth to 12 sons, and one daughter was mentioned. There must have been daughters also.
Yeah.
So I don't know why it's left out like that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't tell you each time why and where, but certainly as far as, I don't know, there are a lot of heroic women in Torah. In fact, most of them do better than the men. Yeah. Miriam, Yocheved, sorry? Sarah, Rachel, Miriam, Rebecca, right? Yitzchak got the wrong idea about his child's education. Rivka has the right idea about what child's education. Similarly, Sarah and Avram. God tells Avram, listen to Sarah. Right? Miriam has the insight in how to raise Moshe Rabbeinu, as opposed to her father Amram, right? And other such scenarios like that.
And you're always saying, the woman is the head of the family.
Yeah, certainly.
And yet they don't mention half the women.
I don't know. Okay. Let's see. So now, but Rabbanon, the sages, who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, what do they make of this verse which says that when wisdom enters into me, I dwell in cunning, then a person acquires the ability for cunning and scheming as well. So what do they do with this verse since they disagree with Rabbi Eliezer? Now, who are these sages? The Gemoro doesn't really say. Who are the sages that disagree with Rabbi Eliezer? Presumably it's Ben Azai. Ben Azai says you should teach your daughters Torah. Right? I think. Sure. Doesn't mention anywhere else any other sages. I don't know who these other rabbis are. Actually doesn't explain for us. Right? So presumably it means Ben Azai. Right?
It says sages
the Rabbanon and the sages.
It
sounds like more than one, right? So it seems like Rabbi Eliezer, who says that a person shouldn't teach his daughter's Torah, seems to be in the minority, unless the sages means those who argue with Rabbi. I don't know. I think it means the sages who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, meaning that they say your person should teach his daughter Torah. It sounds like the majority is not with Rabbi Eliezer here. I think. So I'm watching a different reading of what this means. Tell me. Okay, so so Rabbanon, the sages who disagree with Rabbi Lezer, let's just go with that way of thinking. Hi, ani chachma. What this verse which says, I acquire wisdom, and with that I dwell in cunning, my avidle. What do they do with that verse? Seemingly the verse implies that too much wisdom, or at least in the wrong hands, leads to cunning. So what do they do with that verse? Since they are of the view that you should give Torah to anybody and everybody. So they said like this. They need that verse to provide the teaching that Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina taught us. If Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina said, Torah is not sustained, it only sustains with one who makes himself naked before it. The word for cunning or scheming is arema. Arema could also come from the root word ara, which means to be naked. So Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina says, I am wisdom, I dwell in nakedness. Nakedness meaning I have no other interest. I'm divested of all other interests but Torah. And that's the only way for it to work. I'm wisdom. I dwell in nakedness, as opposed to I dwell in cunning, which was the other interpretation, implying that as you get wisdom, you become more cunning. As you get more Torah, you become more cunning, you become more scheming. He says, you want to learn Torah, it's got to be naked of any other interest. The person has to completely divest himself of all else, and then he can properly learn.
That's like lishma.
Lishma means for the sake of God alone, and that in theory can be done when a person has other interests too. But when I learn, I do it with the intention of learning for the proper reason and not for the sake of self. What here talking about proper learning is to have no other interests in life but the Torah itself, to be naked of all other interests. Sorry?
It's almost like a description of a tzaddik. No, nothing else.
Yeah, so that sounds very lofty level. Yeah, I'll explain what that means more on a more broad level. Rashi gives us another reading to this verse, to this statement. Not shemaimed atzmai oramala, that he makes himself naked before Torah, that is to say, he divests himself of everything. Rather, shemesim atzmai oramala, he not stands naked before the Torah, which means divests himself of all their interests, but rather makes himself naked for it. That is to say, he schemes in such a way that he makes himself available to learn Torah from everybody and anybody. That's the way Rashi. There are two different readings of this meaning, that a person should make himself naked and open. Either no other interests in Torah, or positions himself in such a way that he can gather Torah information from whoever he can.
This is the sages' view?
This is the sages, how they explain this verse.
Does it seem like consistent with Rabbi Eliezer? Because
it's not Rabbi Lezer, it's disputing Rabbi Lezer.
I don't see how it disputes, because because of this, I would understand why women could not adhere to this standard, because they have to worry about their kids, they have to worry about their husband.
Right. Okay, that's a good point, and maybe we'll get to that in a second when we get to the Kabbalistic reading. But on the basic level, what the Gemoro is saying here is that don't derive from this verse that a person who gets wisdom gets automatically cunning. Don't derive that from the verse. You derive that from the verse of Belezer, that a person gets Torah and therefore he gets cunning, and therefore you shouldn't teach your daughter Torah. We say that verse means something else entirely. Right? That's the basic reading of the Gemara. But perhaps we'll get to that in a moment. Okay. Amar Rabbi says, another reading, considering that we talked about a person making himself naked before Torah, that he has no other interest but Torah itself, or the person puts himself in such a way that he can collect Torah from anybody. Rabbi Yochanan adds another layer. And this is a very Hasidic
Can I just
statement.
Go back 1 second?
Yeah.
So in other words, the sages are qualifying that it's not just an outright cleverness from learning Torah. It depends on whether or not how your mind.
The sages dropped the whole notion of cleverness in Torah.
Oh, they dropped it.
That's right. You are interpreting, Rabbi Lezer, this verse to mean that a person who gets Torah acquires cunning. And we, the sages, disagree with that notion. That reading of the Gemara of the verse, we don't read it that way.
Okay.
That verse is not to teach you that a person gets Torah and he can get cunning. No, the Torah, the verse is teaching you how to learn Torah. And the way to learn Torah is by making yourself naked before it, no other interests, or making yourself in such a way, use your cunning to be able to learn Torah from everybody.
Use your cunning.
That's a different way of reading the same, two different readings in Rashi, right? But again, not to teach you that Torah equals cunning. They reject that notion.
They reject it absolutely, or do they qualify?
They reject it absolutely. No, they reject it outright.
Because you're saying that you have to learn it properly, but what about the instances where people are not learning it properly? That's not the
question, though. Again,
No,
let's focus on whatever. Let's try to apply the life. Let's focus on what they're saying. They're rejecting Rabbi Lezer's interpretation of the verse because they have a different interpretation. That's it.
Okay,
that's all. Leave it at that. Exactly. What else is derived from that? Maybe we'll think about that later. But let's just first get down pat what they say. Yeah, exactly. So this is what they say, that do not derive from here there's any cunning.
Wisdom is not.
That's right. Because if you, well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But if you read the verse to mean that Torah equals cunning, then that would put a limit on who and when should one learn Torah.
Yeah.
And we are raising that restriction.
Yeah.
There's no restriction like that. We're just telling you that the verse is teaching you how to properly learn Torah. You want to know how to properly learn Torah? Use your cunning to learn from everybody. You want to properly learn Torah? Make yourself naked of any other interests. But we're not, there's no limitation on who should be learning.
I understand that.
Following?
Thank you. Meaning like the verse, they have a totally different reading of what the verse means.
Exactly. And thus, do not use this verse to apply restrictions to who and when one should learn Torah. It's just teaching you how to properly learn Torah. That's all. Clear? Okay. So find one more statement before we get to the Kabbalistic reading. Yes. Rabbi Yochanan says, in continuation to this notion of how a person should approach Torah, it says like this. This line is very Hasidic. Even before you get to any Hasidic interpretation, the line on its very simple, basic reading is a Hasidic idea, something we've talked about many times. Rabbi Yochanan says, Torah is only sustained only for someone who makes himself as if he is not. Self-surrender, self-negation. Otherwise, Torah is not sustained. This is the most Hasidic line of the Gemoro, if there is one. I know there's many, but this is one such very Hasidic line. Even before you get to any deep interpretation, it's a simple reading, which is a person has to make as if he's nothing. He thinks, I am a someone. That's not the way to learn Torah. Shenemar, as the verse reads.
So they don't single out women in this all.
That's correct. That's right.
Single women out.
That's correct. Rabbi Lezer begins by saying restriction on women because of promiscuity. And then as soon as we get to the verse's interpretation, Rabbi Bowie says any person who gets wisdom gets cunning. Right? And then the sages who disagree and say that verse is not putting limitations on Torah reading. They say anybody should learn Torah properly by making himself naked before Torah. The discussion quickly moved away from women. Which is why we have to come back to the question, why are Lezer singling out women? And I think when we get to so again, simple reading, I think it's the historical context of women's position in society, which, as I said, quoted from the Rebbe, that changed. But on the Kabbalistic reading, I'm going to suggest perhaps why Lezer singles out women. We clear on where we're going?
Yeah.
Good. So Rabbi Yochanan says, here's the verse which backs up this idea that a person who wants to properly study Torah has to make himself as if he's nothing. Completely self-negation. Piece of sand on a beach. Right? Like Avraham Avinu said, I'm but dust and earth, right? Off of Ephraim, right? Dust and dirt, dust and ashes. So, what's the verse that backs us up? Shenemar, as the verse reads, this is a verse quoted in Chassidus 1,000 times. The verse reads like this. The literal meaning of the verse is like this. V'achachma, and wisdom, my ayin, from where timotze is it found? And the verse goes on to say, Ve'eza makam bina, and where is the place of understanding? Right? It's Eov searching for, where Eov, Job, searching, chapter 28, verse 12. He's searching for where does this wisdom come from? Now the word from where, which means my ayin, may, the mem is a prefix from, and the main word is ayin, aleph yud lagunin, which means where. May ayin, from where? But you could also translate it as may ayin, from nothing. Timotze is it found. V'achachma, and wisdom, may ayin, from nothing is it found. So in the context of Rabbi Yochanan's statement, as Rashi explains it, v'achachma, and wisdom, may ayin, from someone who makes himself nothing. Timotze, that's where it's found. Someone who's arrogant does not contain Torah wisdom. But someone who makes himself nothing, that's the one who acquires wisdom. This is Rabbi Yochanan's teaching on its most basic level. And this comes...
His mind is open to the Torah.
Okay, so this is exactly. So this is further to the statement mentioned before by Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, which was that a person should make himself naked before Torah. Right, and there's two readings to that. Divest himself of all other interests but Torah itself. Right, and number two, he should use his scheming to be able to learn from everybody. And on top of that, or adding to that, Rabbi Yochanan says you got to make yourself nothing. So before we get back to the issue of the woman, which we'll get to hopefully above it, let's begin with this statement, right? This last statement, Rabbi Yochanan following the Rabbi bar Chanina. And they're saying one crucial point. And perhaps we can reframe this idea of being naked, divested of any other interest. The way Rashi says it is, make yourself poor. You're not chasing money, you're not chasing fame, you're just here for Torah, naked of any other interests. Right? We can take that to mean not just that in life a person has to have no interests other than his Torah learning, but also perhaps a person doesn't make a living. His Torah is not going to be sustained because he has other interests in life. A person works for a living. Torah wants him to work for a living, right? The famous Gemoro in Brachos, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai says that a person should ignore work and just focus on Torah. And the Gemara says it doesn't work for everybody. The person's got to go to work. So this guy's Torah study is not sustained. So perhaps what this means is, for the hour you're learning, nothing else exists. During the time you're learning, you're naked of any other interest. Right? On the literal level, the way that Rashi interprets it means a person who really wants to acquire Torah has got to let go of any other interest in life. And I'm expanding that to mean perhaps that at least for the time that you have set aside for Torah study, nothing else bothers you. The Rebbe in a talk, we watched this video recently here on the Living Torah program, where the Rebbe talks about the hour of learning should be treated like Shabbos. Your phone rings on Shabbos, you don't answer because it's Shabbos. And the world doesn't exist on Shabbos. For the hour you're learning, same thing. Nothing else exists. Naked from every other interest, at least for the dedicated times for Torah learning, nothing else exists.
Is that why when someone comes in to a shir, interrupts the shir, and it's frowned upon, someone walks in?
Sure. Yeah.
You just about that, right?
Yeah, certainly. Wait till the shir is done, and then we'll take.
Is that the reason why?
Absolutely. When we're learning Torah, nothing else exists. We're naked of any other interests.
It's only take somebody coming into this class once or twice a year and starts asking all kinds of questions.
We're not going to hold it against anybody, God forbid. But that will lead to my next point, which is another element, which is something we talked about many times, which is we all have this, we have two gears in our mind, right? You have Rabbi Simon Jacobson, who is one of the Rebbe's transcribers, who he spoke here on Shabbos once, and he explained that the brain has two wheels, the thinking wheel and the listening wheel, right? And when a person's learning Torah, the thinking wheel has to be turned off and the listening wheel has to be turned on. Only once all the listening is done, the person got all the information, then start to think about what you've learned. But if you're thinking about what you learned while you're still learning it, you're never going to properly get the information you're learning because your brain is already making associations with 1,000 other things. So first absorb the information you're learning, make sure you got it down correctly, and then deal with the analysis afterwards. And that's another interpretation, perhaps what this means, of learn Torah naked of all other interests. Not just all other interests as in forget about your work because now you're focused on learning, but forget about everything else but the line you're reading. Even the other things you know. Clear.
That's a hard one.
It's a very hard one. Put everything else you know aside for the next 20 minutes while you're learning and listen to the text. I don't mean listen to me, the person, but even if you're reading your own book, put everything you know aside and listen to the words being told to you in this book. When you're done absorbing all the information, then you can use your mind to do comparison and analysis and whatnot. Because if you begin with the analysis before you understand what's being said, oftentimes the analysis is built on a very shaky foundation. Because if you heard what it said, you would have known to build it properly. And the question you have wouldn't have existed if you had the text right. Not that there aren't questions sometimes. There are plenty of time with these questions. But first and foremost, naked of all other interests, naked of all other information, just...
use that foundation.
That's right.
Listening.
That's correct.
You had some valid questions.
That's right. That's right. And this is the key. And now the other interpretation was use your scheming to learn from everybody. Right? That was the other interpretation Rashi gave us. Use your scheming to learn from everybody. These two elements of having nothing else in your mind but the text being told to you and making yourself available to learn from everybody come from Rabbi Yochanan's statement, which is make yourself nothing. That's how to learn properly. When I'm learning, it can't be about me. It has to be about the text. Because if it's about me, then I get in the way of the text. Right? Which comes from, as we've been talking about it a number of times, it comes down to this is true, by the way, of any learning, even if you're studying science. A good scientist looks at the data without his own ideas. Just look at the data. Make sure you have all the data. And once you have all the data, you can start analyzing and putting your own ideas, which are sometimes right and sometimes wrong. But if you put your ideas before you gather all the data, you're definitely going to be off the mark, right? That's right. And if you're seeking the truth and data, collect from anybody. Use your cunning to get any information from anybody. If it's about me, then if I acquire the information, I'm proud of it and I want to express it. But somebody else's information, I don't want to hear about it because it's going to undermine my learning. If I put myself aside and it's about the truth of what's here in front of me, then I learn from anybody and everybody. Why not?
Isn't there a sage who
right?
Born in Babylonia and then he was moving
to Israel? Yeah.
And he had to erase his whole mind of what he had learned.
That's right.
Babylonia.
That's correct. That's right. He fasted 40 fasts when he moved from Babylonia to Israel to forget what he learned in Babylonia. Rabbi Zeta. You think he needed to forget the information he learned in Babel? He had to forget the way of thinking. Right? He had to clear his mind. That's right. Clear his mind of who he thinks he is and how he understands to be open to a whole new way of thinking.
That's a very malleable mind.
Oh, yeah. And this is someone who makes himself nothing. Makes himself nothing. The chachma, the wisdom, comes from the one who's nothing. Right. Get to an even deeper understanding. This verse, hachachmat ma'ayin timatzeh, wisdom comes from nothing, as we're learning it here, is that wisdom is to be found, or wisdom is found from nothing, or wisdom from nothing is found. So the way we learned it here is that a person makes himself nothing, that's the one who's going to acquire the wisdom. Chassidus reads it like this. Chachma is the first of the 10 sephiros, first of the 10 attributes, both in the human, which is a reflection of, and a mini-scale version of a divine system. So the first of a divine system and the human system is wisdom. It's the first of 3 capacities of intellect: wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. We'll get to knowledge in a moment, but let's stick with wisdom. Wisdom, as we explained here a number of times, is the capacity to conceive ideas. Understanding, stage 2, is the capacity to absorb ideas, to understand ideas, to break them down, to analyze them, to think about them, to consider them. But wisdom is the capacity to conceive of ideas, right? Sorry?
Break them down is Bina.
Bina, that's right. Second stage, Bina. But the first stage, Chachma, is the capacity to conceive of ideas. Now, this capacity to conceive of ideas is found me'ayin from nothing. Why is it found from nothing? It's certainly found from somewhere. But it's nothing we can identify. It comes from a place in the brain that transcends my consciousness. What I mean is like this. We all come up with ideas, but it's not as if you can go into your brain, open up a drawer with all the ideas you'll ever come up with and pull them out.
Yeah.
Right? But just all of a sudden, an idea pops into your brain. So you know there's some part of you that's capable of coming up with ideas because they come out of somewhere, right? But what exactly that place is, you don't really know. So you can't exactly go into the drawer of that part of your brain and find it. Meaning like this, information you've gathered around in life, memories you have, you can concentrate, open up the file cabinet of your memories, go to a certain, let's say, you want to remember something you read in a museum somewhere. So you can go into the memory of that city, right? Go into the memory of the day you went into that museum, where you were, what it looked like, what you were dressed like, who you were with, and then open up in your brain the window to that particular item, and you can remember what it said there, what it was about, right? Because you're kind of filing through it. You can't do that with ideas, right? And that's what it means. They come out of nothing. They come out of the part of the brain that's I can't describe it. So you need to say
it's not like a recall of past memory per se.
Exactly.
It just be something entirely novel.
It's possible that it comes from memories that you have, but it's right. That's right. So nothing then, Chassidus explains, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Nothing just means it's transcendent from what I can identify. But I know it's there because it produces things. Right? And that is the loftiest level of Chachma, in which the source is God himself. And then from God emerges the system which begins with Chachma. Now you know there's a source to all of this existence because it came from somewhere, but the source, God himself, is transcendent. Right? So how does a person elicit Chachma, even in my own, how does a person elicit an idea? If I can't go into my memory and pull out an idea from a filing cabinet, how do I come up with an idea? The way to come up with an idea, this is the creative talent, the artistic, the artist's creative, what do they call it? The creative process of the artist, right? The creative process of the artist is not to focus on something and come up with an idea, but actually to clear the mind and allow for something to come out. This is why often when you're thinking about something, a problem, you're trying to solve a problem, go to sleep, wake up in the morning. Meditate to clear your brain. Because when you're busy, stuck, or trying to analyze the issue, you're so caught up in your own thought process that there's no space in your brain for a new idea to emerge. You have to allow for the nothing that transcendent part of you to just put something in there. So you got to make space for it.
Very difficult today with all the distractions.
Extremely difficult. Extremely. But if you think about it, the best ideas come on Shabbos because you're not distracted. Your brain is open, right? When your phone's not with you, right? So you sleep over it. You wake up in the morning, your brain is fresh, and boom, an idea arrives. So it's specifically when you're not stuck in thinking about it that the new information can emerge. And this connects to the simple reading of Rabbi Yochanan. Make yourself nothing. Stop thinking. Put everything aside, and then you'll allow for true wisdom to emerge. You'll allow for a really true novel idea to emerge.
It's funny because it appears to be the antithesis of Shabbat, where Shabbat's the end of creation. You're not supposed to create anything, but yet it's the whole genesis of new creation.
That's correct. Shabbos is actually is to reverse back to the source of creation. It's to rest. Resting means you're going back. No, what's resting? I expend energy in a certain activity. I rest so that energy goes back to its source.
But it seems
it's paradoxical. It's counterintuitive. Counterintuitive. That's right. Yeah. So all to say that when a person truly wants to, experience a novel, let's say, insight, or then a novel level of divine, since you're talking about studying Torah, the person has to clear himself of what he thinks he knows. And then you can allow for something truly new to emerge and arrive.
Something that is innate in most of us.
Sorry?
It's not something innate in most of us to think this way. Think that most people want to engage constantly.
That's right.
Step back is
the mind is always working.
Right.
You go to sleep peacefully, then you're open.
That's right, because you're not stuck in the way you're not stuck in your own. That's right. You're not stuck in your own thought process. You allow for something really new and novel to arrive. And this then is perhaps the solution to Rabbi Lezer's problem, which is the sages who disagree with Rabbi Lezer, right? Rabbi Lezer is the one who said, Rabbi Bo, explaining Rabbi Lezer, said, the verse reads, a person gets Torah, and as he acquires Torah, he becomes more cunning. So the sages say, well, if you're learning Torah like that, you got it wrong. Because why is it that when a person gets more wisdom, he gets more cunning? Because it's right, because it's not about, he's busy trying to figure out how he can use whatever is there to his own scheme. That's not truly being open to learning. You want to truly be open to learning? Put your schemes aside. Be open to something new and real. It's a difference between the pursuit of the truth because it's true versus pursuit of the truth so it can serve me and what I want.
What it'll do for me.
That's correct. So if I'm looking at wisdom for what it can do for me, it's going to lead to all kinds of scheming and mistakes. Right? But when it comes to, like Rabbi Yochanan is saying, make yourself nothing. It's not about me. It's not about how smart I am and how much I know, but it's about God's truth. Be open to it itself. You're open to it, and there's no scheming coming from your learning. It's just going to be about connecting to what is the truth, always being open to the truth. It's not about me and the scheming, right?
Once you start acquiring this knowledge,
stay
true.
Now, this is perhaps going back now on a Kabbalistic level. I want to make this clear. This is a Kabbalistic level. Why Rabbi Lezer singles out a woman? Because in Kabbalah, man is Chachma and woman is Bina. Explain why. So you have an idea, and then you have, right, the idea arrives, emerges, and then you have the analysis. And then when the idea is analyzed by the analysis, by Bina, then you can produce a feeling, which is the next thing, which is das, which we'll get to in a moment, right? Producing a feeling based on the idea, right? This is good, I want it. This is no good, I want to stay away from it, right? That feeling, I want it, or I want to stay away from it, love and fear, is produced by the understanding of the idea, right? So it's chachma, the idea, goes to bina, the understanding, and then that produces the conclusion, which is, I want this, I don't want this, right? So in Kabbalah, this is father, mother, and child. Father is the idea, just like a husband makes a seed. And then the understanding is the analysis of that idea. That's parallel to a woman who breaks down the seed to produce the child. Right? So it's chachma, bina, and then the child. Well, that's the combination of the two. A woman is specifically bina, as we actually say, the Gemoro, our sages teach us, bina yisera nida b'isha. A woman has, there's two interesting statements about women when it comes to intelligence. One statement is, bina yisera nida b'isha. Women have an extra bina. But then it also says, nashim daitan kalas. Women's das, their knowledge, is weak. So extra understanding, but their wisdom is weak. It doesn't say they don't have, their knowledge is weak. It doesn't say they have no das. It says their das is weak. What does that mean? So perhaps it goes like this. Bina, right, is the capacity to understand, to absorb information and develop it. Right? That's what Bina is, which physically it's a woman does. She absorbs the seed and develops it into a fetus. Right? That's what a woman does, specifically. That's what a woman does. Now, Bina Yisaya, this added understanding, is in some ways perhaps a woman's unique ability to be able to listen to someone else. Men are always trying to prove themselves. They always want to give, physically, women, even biologically, men always want to spread their seed, and women are much more selective about their seed. This is a biological truth. In the animal kingdom too. Male lions want to impregnate as many women as possible, female lions. And female lions are selective about which male they want because they're going to develop it and it's better be very specifically good. Whereas a man just wants to, in the language of the Gemoro, ish daiche lichbosh. Man's nature is to conquer. Right? So a woman's internalization of information is so much deeper, so much greater. She listens. She absorbs, every comedian makes these jokes about this, that men are trying to fix all the problems. And the woman's saying, I'm not interested in you fixing it. Just listen to my problem. That's all. Right? The man's like, okay, how do I fix it? He always wants to produce, give a solution, fix it, give a solution. Like chachma, producing. Whereas the woman's like, don't produce. I want you to absorb. Right? The woman has this capacity to listen. That's this bina yisera. Now, what happens when a person has a good capacity to listen? They become very, very empathetic and very attached emotionally to what they're learning. And that's das. Das is the attachment to what you're learning. Right? Why do you want something? Right? We said before, a person has an idea, understands it, and says, I want it or don't want it. This I want it or don't want it is to be attached to this idea. This idea is real, and therefore I want it. This idea is real, therefore I better stay away from it. Right? So the deeper I have the ability to understand, the more readily I'm emotionally attached to what I'm understanding. And that's perhaps what it means, daiton kalos, their knowledge, their das is weak. Not because they lack information, but because they're so attached to it that they, weak in the sense of they quickly fall for it. They become much more emotionally attached to to the information they're learning because of their extra absorption capacity. Following? So it's not to say, that's right. Their emotional attachment to scenarios, to things, to ideas is much more deep. And that daiton kal doesn't mean weak knowledge, doesn't mean that they don't have the capacity to think. But the intimate connection they feel is weak in the sense that they can't hold themselves back from feeling because they have a much deeper understanding. They have a much deeper capacity to absorb, to empathize. Right? Following? And therefore, so that's the upside of woman. That's the upside of the feminine idea. Right?
Just trying to how to link this with our
so now let's link this with Rabbi Lezer. What Rabbi Lezer is saying is like this. When it comes to learning, has the right right, which means if you want to have new novel idea, you have to detach yourself from it. So it's the emotional attachment to the learning, to the ideas, that's the downside here, which is also the upside. Right? Sorry?
That could be the
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Because what we require here is to put my own attachments aside to allow for the new ideas to come, right? That's the strength and the weakness of women, that they're much more attached to the ideas. They're much more connected. Even though this is a problem for both men and women, but I'm giving the feminine and male dimension. The male dimension is producing the ideas, which is built on being open to allowing for new things to arrive, right? The female dimension is to be attached to what you're reading, to be connected, to feel it. And because for proper Torah learning, I'm just trying to work through this, but perhaps because for the proper Torah learning to be sustained, the person has to put himself aside to allow for the truth of it to come in. So the attachment that the woman feels, which is her plus, is also the downside here, because she's very emotionally connected to what she's reading and learning. Right? And in order for the learning to be sustained as we're learning here, the person has to detach himself and say, it's not about me, only about the truth. Not about how I feel, but what's the truth in and of itself. And this is perhaps the balance between the feminine and masculine components of learning that the Gemara is juggling here. Right? On the one hand, you have to have this wisdom element. Yeah, well, let me rephrase that. If you have the wisdom element, it means you have information and you're attached to it, but don't set yourself aside. There could be the downside here, right? The scheming, the cunning, because I use it for my own self. Right? But if you have only the masculine side, then it becomes completely emotionally detached, and it doesn't become real. It becomes abstract. It's irrelevant. So it has to be kind of a balance between the two. I'm not sure if I'm being clear.
It's hard to understand because from the learning,
yeah,
your mind is open.
Yeah.
Just the learning,
I think you're putting aside the feminine dimension during that time, because the feminine dimension is to be emotionally attached to it. You have to put that aside when you're learning. After you're done learning, now you're emotionally attached to it once you've garnered the truth, right? But if you come emotionally attached before you learn, you're not learning properly.
But the chachma is not the idea anymore. The chachma is just in the learning.
What do you mean? Explain again.
When you explain it in the chachma being on das.
Yeah.
So chachma is, I've got an idea. My mind is ready.
Yeah.
An idea comes when I'm sleeping or something.
Yeah.
Bina is when I wake up in the morning and I start to understand it.
Analyze it, break it down.
Analyze it, break it down.
Yeah.
Okay, let's say I dream about building a building that's going like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's my dream. That's my chachma.
Yeah.
Bina is, okay, I've got the plans. This is the way it's going to look, but how is it going to be?
Right.
And the das is being built.
Right. The das is the emotional motivation to get it done.
Okay. But when you're studying, the chachma is coming from what you're studying.
Right. So exactly.
It's coming from something else. It's not coming from your mind.
Right. Okay, that's a good point. In other words, the idea is not coming out of nowhere. It's coming from the book you're reading. Right. But you have to use the chachma capacity to be able to absorb it. In other words, you have to have that element of openness to what's coming. Even if it's not coming from me, I have to have the element of openness to what's coming. Right? So that's what I think what's happening here is while a person is learning, the person has to use the male dimension, which is the capacity to be detached, just to allow for the truth to come in. Because it's not about me, it's about the truth. Once the Torah is absorbed on the foundation of that openness to the truth, then there comes the emotional attachment in a healthy way, which will avoid the scheming. Because if I begin with my emotional attachments of what I want, then I don't take the truth for what it is. I take the truth for how it works for me. And then there's all the scheming and negativity and promiscuity. So during the learning, it's got to be open. This is God's Torah. I'm accepting God's truth, close down, so to speak, the feminine dimension. After the person's done learning, then he can emotionally attach to it because he's garnered the truth. The truth is here. Now emotionally connects to it. Now analyze it. Now use that feminine dimension. So maybe that's the balance here, which is why Rabbi Lezer singles out women, because during the learning itself, it's got to be the male dimension, which is openness to learning. This is the truth, detached emotionally. And only after the learning, then comes the emotional attachment. But if the emotional attachment's right from the beginning, then that learning is going to become scheming. It's going to be about me and how I feel and how I want, as opposed to what's the truth of it. Maybe this is perhaps the balance here on this Kabbalistic level, assuming that we're applying this rule universally. And I'm just using the woman, not as a woman per se, but as a feminine dimension of thinking.
But you can't go off.
Perhaps.
You can't go astray.
Sorry?
You can't go astray. You can't, when you're getting at Bina stage,
yeah.
you've got the chachma and you just learned something.
Yeah.
And you're trying to analyze it and think, but you're thinking, hey, maybe think it like I just learned I could do anything I want, any sin I want. All I have to do is say tshuva.
Right.
So she's saying, I just learned something great. And then she goes astray and she starts saying, I can do this, I can do that, I can do this,
right.
I can do this.
So
instead of thinking straight.
Right. So what the Gemoro is saying is the reason why you're taking that information and going astray with it is because when you learned, you weren't out for the truth, you were out for yourself.
That's right.
You have to close down the emotional element, the personal investment when you're beginning the learning process. Right? Whereas if there's Bina Yeseda, if there's an added understanding, which is a valuable thing, it could lead to Daiton Kalas. It could lead to weak emotional attachment, and then you become emotionally attached too quickly and not stay objective.
You lose the whole thing.
That's right. And that's where the scheming problem comes in. So I think it's a balance between the feminine and masculine dimension, meaning putting away specifically men and women on the literal level, right. Meaning the feminine and masculine dimension, which we all incorporate all of them. We incorporate elements of the feminine and the masculine, and so on and so forth. And the question of using all these faculties at the right time in the right place in their appropriate thing. And that's what perhaps what the Gemoro is trying to do here. That while we're learning, you got to detach all emotional elements. And if you have that feminine dimension, which is the emotional attachment right from the beginning, meaning to say, you're learning to begin with, it's about me and how I feel, then it can go astray. First, learn with open mind, no emotional personality. Only afterwards, only once you've earned the truth, then there could be an emotional attachment to it. So you feel for the truth, so you care for the truth, so you feel compassionate for the truth, which is the feminine value of the learning element. But that only comes after there's the wisdom that's like Rabbi Yochanan said, you make yourself nothing. How I feel is irrelevant. What's the truth of God's Torah? That's all.
Really is not the woman's,
which is the masculine dimension, to be emotionally detached. It's also a negative, right? If a person's emotionally attached at the wrong time, it's a terrible thing, right? So it's each one has its virtue and its time and place. Yes, yeah. That's perhaps what's going on here on a deeper Kabbalistic level. But again, on the literal level, I think it's to be understood in historical context, which again, that previous class we talked about a bit more. All right. There's a lot to think about. And again, the floor is open to disagreeing, agreeing. And as you can see, I'm kind of working through this idea as we're speaking. But this is where my thought process is on this whole discussion. Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay. Wonderful day, Eden.
Wow.